Ghosts don't kill people, do they? Well, tonight I'll show you a British haunting case that turns deadly. This barely discussed yet scary paranormal ordeal involves a Catholic family who move into a council house in Birmingham, England. They love 32 Coxwell Road, at least at first, but after only a few weeks of moving in, they are plagued with supernatural activity that culminates in the death of their youngest child. The official explanation? A tragic misfortune. But the family weren't convinced. Not after what their young son claimed to have seen just before the death. Not after the priest who blessed the house said the presence was too powerful to remove. And not after the final incident that sent them running from 32 Coxwell Road forever. And keep watching, because after investigating the hidden history of both Coxwell Road and the land beneath it, we have uncovered disturbing, long-forgotten facts that suggest this entire area of land may be plagued with paranormal events. You're about to discover the haunting that turned deadly, because I'm Peter Laws and this is Into the Fog. Our story begins at number 32 Coxwell Road, in a place called Ladywood in Birmingham, England. Now don't bother trying to find this road on the maps, you'll be disappointed. The house and the road no longer exist. That's because a new housing development was built on the site in the 1960s, so we can't be certain where this particular house once stood, but it does appear to be somewhere around the current Coxwell Gardens and the surrounding areas. The people who live in Ladywood today are probably unaware that Coxwell Road ever existed, but back in 1955, locals were lining up to live in Coxwell Road. According to local newspapers, there were 50,000 people on the housing waiting list at that time, and among them were the Pell family. The father's name was Francis Pell, though he's sometimes referred to as Frank. Frank was an ex-paratrooper, meaning a soldier trained to parachute into combat zones. And right now he was dropping his wife and 3 children into a council house. In the US, you'd probably call it public housing. The Pells were given the keys in and around June of 1955. And even in the 1950s, this 3-bedroomed house with a basement was described as an older type of property. It was neither grand nor impressive. But to Frank, this semi-detached house on Coxwell Road felt like a gift. You see, they had previously been living in a terrible property. That place was in such a state of disrepair that it was condemned. Frank's wife was called Gertrude, and she loved this new house too. She told the People newspaper that number 32 had been newly decorated, was as clean as a new pin, and seemed to be the answer to our prayers. Now, being a strong Catholic family, they invited Father Francis Etherington to come and bless the house. Yet only days after moving in, on the very first weekend in fact, their descent into supernatural despair began. Something very strange began to wake the Pell family in the middle of the night. The doors of the house, they started banging. And because there's so little written about this case online, I don't know if that means a fist hammering on the doors or if they were opening and slamming shut, banging like that over and over. Either way, it's a terrifying thought to hear in the middle of the night. Can you imagine? You go to bed tonight and you wake up, something is hammering on all of your doors. The sound was shocking enough to wake every member of the Pell family up, and so Frank leapt out of bed to investigate. And yet, after a careful patrol through the entire house, he found nothing that could have made those sounds. No damaged doors, no signs of forced entry. And then the noises started again, only this time it was coming from the ceiling above the kitchen. Loud thuds. It sounded like someone was up there stamping on the floor. But again, nothing could be found in that upstairs room to explain it. Now, as the days passed, they tried to settle into the home, but the home began to exhibit strange smells, like the stench of garlic that would turn into the smell of burning rubber. This smell was serious enough for the Pells to contact the local housing management department, who sent people out to discover where those smells were coming from. No source could be found. Despite the banging and these aromas, the Pell family seemed to be a pretty stoic bunch. Indeed, during his military career, Frank had done over 40 parachute drops into enemy territory, so he wasn't easily spooked. And so the Pells shrugged these things off as odd, but ultimately they felt they were nothing to worry about. By the way, if you ever see what looks like a tape recording of a voice on this show, that's to indicate it's a direct quote from the people involved. And so they tried to ignore the haunting, but then, 3 weeks after they had moved in, the odd turned into the appalling. Because that is when an awful tragedy struck the house. And some viewers might find the next few minutes disturbing. Moving house can be stressful. Having a child, even more so. Well, Mrs. Pell had given birth to a baby boy just a week before the family had moved into 32. The boy's name was Michael Gordon Pell. I found a newspaper report that claims the child was female, but after looking at various sources, we can confirm that it was male. And on the morning of June of 1955, the Pells woke to a nightmare. It had been oppressively hot in the night. So hot, in fact, that the Pells had thrown off the bed covers to keep cool. Frank woke up at about 7 a.m. and went downstairs to make a cup of tea. But when he came back upstairs, he discovered that Gertrude was awake. She was holding baby Michael, but looked distressed. And she said, "What's happened to my baby?" They both could see that little Michael did indeed look strange, with half of his face purple in colour. So they tried blowing air onto him. Nothing happened. And so they called the doctor. And when the doctor came, he confirmed the unthinkable. Michael was dead. And so this baby, who was barely a month old, was taken for a post-mortem examination. And as they waited, Frank and Gertrude were overwhelmed with not only shock, but guilt. Gertrude had brought the baby into the bed sometime in the night, which meant that the most obvious explanation was also the most devastating. Had one of them accidentally rolled onto the child and in sleep smothered him? Well, the Pells struggled to accept this. Mr. Pell told the People newspaper, "If I rolled on him during my sleep, there would have surely been bruises of some kind on so small a child." But the inquest concluded that the baby, despite being in perfect health, had died from accidental death from suffocation. Now let's take a second here, because we have to be open to the possibility that this is precisely what happened, that this really was just a tragic yet unintentional misstep. Indeed, an inquest discovered that Gertrude had been given leaflets by the health authorities warning of the danger of sleeping with newborns. She admitted she'd read those leaflets, but she also said that when she heard Michael crying in the night and how hot it was, she still took him into the bed to feed him. And while she was doing so, she fell asleep. The next thing she remembered was waking up to find Michael's body. So yes, this part of the story may be nothing more than a horrible tragedy. But it's when you consider what had happened up to that point, but especially after, which I'm about to tell you. Well, that's when this story blurs the line between a natural tragedy and possibly an example of the darkest paranormal. The feeling that there was more to this than just an accident started subtly. Gertrude Pell had a memory of something that had happened not long before the baby died. She had been up in their new attic, clearing space to store the family's belongings, when she came across an old newspaper. It was dated July 12th, 1917, and it had been folded in such a way that only the headline was visible, and printed in bold letters it read, "Watch your children." Nothing else could be seen at the time, just those words. And it meant little, just a fragment of the past from a previous occupant, but after her son's death, as she thought back to this, it felt almost like a warning. And remember that year too, 1917. We will come back to that era when we uncover fresh revelations about the history of Coxwell Road. Well, if the newspaper was all there was, perhaps the Pells would have been able to start rebuilding their lives in that home despite their loss. But then, a few days after the death, one of their other children spoke up. And what he said was horrifying. Before their other sons spoke to them, the paranormal events carried on in the house. In fact, they grew much worse. Every night, usually at 10:20 p.m., they would hear a distinct tapping sound striking the ceiling above the kitchen. It clearly sounded like someone was up there trying to get their attention, yet no visible cause of this frantic tapping was ever found. It's important to note, by the way, that this tapping was not only observed by the Pells, but by their friends and relatives when they came to visit, and nobody could figure out what was making it. The doors would start banging once again. This happened not once or twice, but repeatedly, night after night after night at intervals, and always in the early hours of the morning. There were sudden changes in temperature too. One moment the kitchen would feel normal, the next it would plunge into bitter coldness, and the strange smells returned, the burning rubber, the garlic. But then new phenomena began to emerge. For example, they started to hear something from the upstairs room. It was an eerie sound which at first they could not identify, but then it became very clear indeed. It was whispering. Someone was in the upstairs room of their new house, frantically whispering. The Pells described it as being like someone was talking too close to a microphone. I have a microphone right here. So let me just make that sound right now so we can imagine what this would have sounded like coming from the empty room upstairs. It would sound something like this. Watch your children, their eyes are lost in their watch your falling lashes, watch your children, watch your children. It would just be so freaky. Yet just like the banging, whenever the family rushed up to push that door in, the room was completely empty. Now all of this was frightening enough, but then something happened that would change everything. A detail that, quite frankly, sent a shiver down my spine. Now remember that as well as the baby, the Pells had two of the children. One of them, their 4-year-old son, was called Alan. And 4 days after the baby died, Alan said something very strange to his parents. It was a question that made no sense. Alan said, "Did baby go with the little white dog?" Frank and Gertrude were confused. They didn't have a little white dog. So they said, "What dog, Alan?" "Why, the little dog who comes and sits on my bed sometimes." They looked at one another confused, but what Alan said next turned their blood cold. After saying the dog had sat on his bed, Alan added this. "I saw him sitting on the baby's face the night baby left us." When Gertrude heard this, she simply collapsed into uncontrollable sobbing. Frank, however, immediately grabbed his coat and he rushed to the police station to tell them what Alan had said. Why? Well, because he felt there may well have been a dog in their house. Maybe the previous owners had left it, or one from the street had gotten in. Could that explain what had happened? Now, I know this might sound unlikely, the idea of an animal being trapped in your house, but this literally happened to me a few weeks ago. My family and I went to stay in a cabin in the woods for a few days. And when we returned to the house, which was fully locked up, mind you, we unloaded our cases and bags in the hall, and we heard the strangest sound. It was like confused. I thought my daughter was putting weird sound effects on the Alexa. To be fair, she'd done just that while we were away. She cast fart noises to the cabin next door when she hopped onto their Spotify party at midnight, but she insisted that these weird noises were not from her. And so I went upstairs searching for the sound, and what do I see sitting on the landing just near my bedroom? A black cat. We don't own a black cat or any animal, and yet here it was just looking at me, a black cat. Totally confused, we checked the windows, they were all locked, checked all the doors, they were fully locked too. I went to give this strange cat some water, but it just rushed past me, ran off into the street. Turned out this cat lived a few streets up and had a habit of entering people's homes. Thankfully, the cat got home. So to me, that's a reminder that Frank's notion of a dog getting into his house without them realizing it, or maybe being left over before they moved in, is not as crazy as it sounds. And indeed, if there was a dog roaming about their new home after dark, could that be what it was causing the strange noises they were hearing, or maybe even climbing up onto the baby to suffocate it under its fur? Well, the police took this very seriously too, and they agreed that it was vital to check the house, and it might offer a fresh explanation of Michael's death. So the officers came to Coxwell Road and they searched the place from top to bottom, But they didn't find any dog. Indeed, they found no signs that a dog had ever been there. Believe me, we found plenty of signs that the black cat had been roaming about in our house for a few nights, especially in the clothes blanket. Well, the Pells began to wonder then, if it wasn't a physical dog, could it be something else? And could it be linked to the growing poltergeist activity in the house? Well, the banging, the whispering, the temperature drops, the smells, and Alan's sighting of the dog prompted Frank and Gertrude to finally accept there might be something spiritually wrong in their house. What if it was actually haunted and whatever lurked there was deadly? So they immediately called for Father Etherington and they asked him to come to the house to carry out an exorcism. Knowing what they had been through, the priest agreed to come out to 32 Coxwell. He arrived with a rosary and some holy water and proceeded to walk around the house, blessing it and telling whatever lurked there to leave. There was another visitor there that night too, a relative called Joe Neal, and at one point during the exorcism, Father Etherington and Joe entered the upstairs room. They were standing in that room when suddenly the tapping noises started again, and after the tapping, the eager whispering began too. The two men listened to this for a while and just turned and had to get out. Rattled, Father Etherington came back downstairs and told Frank to his face, "There is something in this house and it's too strong for me to cast out." And instead, he advised the Pells that they should move out of that house as soon as possible because, he said, quote, "It is bad for you." Now, some of you might have agreed and started packing that very night, but not Frank and Gertrude Pell. They were a stubborn and proud couple, perhaps, but I think more likely they had been on that epically long waiting list for a house, so they didn't want to be driven from it only to be pushed to the back of the queue again. So instead, they said they should fight this presence and stand up to it. And yet their staying would lead to an incident so frightening that Frank and his family fled that house in terror, knowing they could never ever live there another day. Wait till you hear this. The tipping point incident appeared at the start of July 1955. It didn't even happen in the night, but in the bright light of morning. Frank had got up and was shaving in the downstairs of the house. And by this point, the whole family were used to living in a home with paranormal activity. The banging, the tapping, the cold spots, the smells were carrying on day after day. But on that particular morning, something changed with the whispering. Up until that morning, the whispering had always come from the upstairs room. But right now, as Frank was gliding a razor across his face and slushing it in the sink, he suddenly heard the whispering again. Only this time it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was right behind him. As if whatever was making that sound had ventured down the staircase to find him. And so he spun around in shock, expecting, at least hoping, it was just Gertrude coming to speak to him. But even though she was the only other person in that house at the time, there was nobody there. Confused and unsettled, and no doubt with half a face full of shaving foam, he ran to the foot of the staircase to see if Gertrude was okay. He was in for a shock. You see, Frank stopped dead at the bottom of the staircase because as he looked up, he could see his wife standing at the top. Only she wasn't just standing there for some reason in total silence. She had her mouth wide open and gaping. Frank was really worried for her. She'd been through such a lot with Michael's death, including the guilt around that. And that had only happened last month. And so he rushed up to meet her. Maybe she was having some sort of breakdown and he wanted to help her, to comfort her. But as he reached halfway up that staircase, he told reporters that he felt his body hitting some kind of invisible barrier. It was crazy. And yet there seemed to be an unseen wall stopping him going up to help Gertrude. And so he pushed, and he said to the reporters that he tried to grab the banister to pull himself up to give him more power, and eventually by doing that, he could start to penetrate this invisible field, and suddenly he broke through that wall and was stumbling up the next step. But this is so interesting and creepy too. As soon as he breached that bizarre invisible divide, he suddenly heard the sounds of his wife's open mouth. Like suddenly the sound had just been clicked on. She was screaming. That's why her mouth had been open, and it was crystal clear. And those horrific screams that he could hear also were woven in with bitter sobbing. It was pitiful, it was shocking. One step lower, he couldn't hear a thing. Now the shrieks coming from her pierced his ears. Well, he rushed up to her and managed to calm her down, asking her what had happened, and she told him. It was the whispering. The whispering presence from the room upstairs. Not only had it come down to find Frank this morning as he shaved, but it had come at the precise same time to find her in the house too. Does that mean there were more than one presence in the house, but two? Was there even a third that had stood on the staircase now, trying to keep this husband and wife apart? There was a chilling and calculated cruelty to what happened that morning, and it was the final straw. Frank and Gertrude Pell knew that they could no longer remain in this haunted and potentially homicidal home. And so that night they left. And I mean, they left, like the Lutz family did in the famous Amityville horror case. You know, when George and Kathy Lutz found their dream home in Ocean Avenue, but then fled after a haunting. By the way, if you're interested in the Amityville case, you can explore my deep dive on it here, where I look at evidence that suggests that there really might have been something to that haunting after all. Check that out. But yes, that night, the Pells left all of their belongings and just raced out of there never to return. And they were heartbroken to have to give up this house, especially when the waiting list for a decent council home was so long. The thought of giving that house for a silly prank for the newspapers, seems unlikely. Indeed, they wouldn't even go near the house to collect their possessions. They were just too scared. They had to arrange for Frank's 22-year-old niece, June Hadley, and her 23-year-old fiancé, Dennis Savage, to go back to the house and collect their stuff. It was a Monday night when June and Dennis arrived to collect the belongings from number 32. Yet when they entered the house, they too heard the tapping sounds, and they too felt such a sense of oppression that they turned on their heels and fled. Meanwhile, Frank and Gertrude and the remaining Pell children had to live a few streets away in what the newspaper described as wretched surroundings. Yet, no matter how much they loved the house on Coxwell, they were both happier to live in a rundown hovel than a pretty yet thoroughly haunted house. And what of the aftermath to the case? Well, 32 Coxwell Road belonged to Birmingham Council. They sent around a team to fully investigate. They hoped to find a natural explanation for the banging, the temperature drops, the smells. They did find a tiny gas leak in one of the rooms and wondered whether or not that had anything to do with it, particularly the smell. The People newspaper sent a photographer to stay in the house, and they indeed experienced the sudden drops in temperature, and they described a musty smell in certain rooms that mysteriously came and went. I read a piece that said 2 reporters also stayed in the home, and they heard the jabbering voices in the house. Well, word of this haunting got out, and on the 4th of August 1955, the Birmingham Gazette reported that the South Staffordshire Metaphysical Society asked if they could carry out a ghost hunt at number 32 Coxwell Road. The city's housing manager refused the request, saying, "I have no reason to think there is any foundation for these stories which have been circulated about this dwelling." A new tenant called George Harris moved in then, along with his wife Elsie and 6 children. The society approached George direct for permission to do a paranormal investigation. He turned them down, and he told the newspaper, "We've seen and heard nothing peculiar since we moved in here. It's a nice house and we are happy." Ghosts, he said? They're all baloney. Now, does the story end there? Well, you would think so when you read about this stuff online, but wait till you hear what we've managed to uncover. For this episode, I brought in Mandy West from The Haunted Historian. Mandy is a researcher who works with paranormal investigators to uncover the documented history of the locations they explore. And when she works on a case, she prefers to initially work completely blind, without any prior knowledge that might influence the direction of her research or color the conclusions that she draws. So I gave her no dates, No names and no details whatsoever, apart, of course, from one thing: the address. 32 Coxwell Road, Ladywood, Birmingham. So she set about investigating the history of the house and the land it stood on, and the results are fascinating and in places quite chilling. She found that before the Pells, 32 Coxwell Road had been occupied continuously since 1871, and on paper it looks unremarkable. Names come and go through the records. For decades, number 32 was home to a single family, the Robothams. And it looks like Harriet Robotham died in the house in 1926, followed by her husband, William, in 1937. But I was particularly interested to learn about the land itself, because that has a far darker history. Between 1631 and 1637, Birmingham was struck by a devastating plague. And like many towns at the time, the dead had to be buried quickly to avoid infection. This would often happen in mass graves away from populated areas. Archival records show one of these plague pits was located specifically in Ladywood, the precise area where 32 Coxwell Road stood. Mandy found evidence of locals calling it Pest Ground or Pest Heath. And her report said that the Pells house and its neighbouring properties had most likely been erected on the site of one of these plague pits, where all of these bodies had been buried. Now, this point about the neighbouring properties is important because Mandy then started to explore other numbers in that street, and she found more reports of the paranormal. For example, in July of 1989, the Sandwell Evening Mail received a letter. In it, a Mrs. Carissa A. Young wrote that in 1919, her mother-in-law, Evelyn May Drain, lived with her family at number 38 Coxwell Road. Evelyn was a young child then, about 8 years old in fact, but she claimed that her house was haunted, and many strange things happened. These paranormal events even included her being levitated up the stairs. So that's two properties, only a few doors apart, near or even above a plague pit, with reported supernatural activity, including that which particularly focuses on the staircase. I also couldn't help but notice the date, too. Evelyn was a child when she was levitated up the stairs in 1919, and just a few doors down at that time was number 32, where records tell us the Robotham family lived at that time. Can you remember how Gertrude found that newspaper in the attic saying, "Watch your children"? That newspaper was from 1917, around the same time-ish as Evelyn's childhood haunting. And so there could be a physical item that may connect both of these cases. But Mandy was also able to dig up another unsettling news report from Coxwell Road, and this is the one that really got under my skin. It goes back to the year 1881, and on Tuesday, the 6th of December of that year, an inquest was held at Borough Lunatic Asylum. It concerned the death of a woman called Emily Mary Siffield. This 48-year-old woman had been admitted to the asylum 24 hours before she died. Why was she admitted? Well, about a week before, Emily had a sudden and severe change in her behavior. Admission records for the asylum say that she started to display episodes of hallucinations and delirium, which were so severe that she was taken to the asylum. And this was a really horrific journey for Emily, because they took ages, the authorities did, with getting her paperwork in order. And so Emily was stuck in the closed carriage with the blinds shut for over 2 hours. She was then admitted to the asylum, where she died 24 hours later. And it was thought that the death was due to the fatty degeneration of the heart. Now keep Emily in mind, because 1 year later, another woman called Clara Bardell was admitted to All Saints Hospital. She had also been said to be suffering from sudden hallucinations and delirium, and she was described as making involuntary movements. A medical assessment was done on Clara, and it recorded that she says she will have to be buried alive and she has been wicked to God. She was admitted to care in 1882 and stayed until her death in 1917. Interestingly, the year that the newspaper was printed with the warning to watch your children. Clara was buried in unconsecrated ground in Handsworth. Now, why are we talking about these two women? On Monday brought them to my attention because of where they lived. Both Emily and Clara lived on Coxwell Road. In fact, they lived together. Mandy checked the census records for 1881, and though the writing is not very clear, so we can't be certain of the exact number where they lived, we do know two things. One, we know that Clara and Emily definitely lived in the same house. But we also know that that house number began with a 3. That much is visible. Could it mean that these two ill-fated women lived in one of the 30s in Coxwell Road? Could it be 32 where the Pells haunting happened, or 38 where Evelyn Drain was levitated up the stairs only 2 years after Clara's death? We don't know, and perhaps this is unrelated, but it does open an eerie possibility. The medical admission documents for both Clara and Emily show that their sudden delirium was extremely out of character, arriving without incident or warning, and yet both women who lived in the same house on Coxwell Road in a number beginning with 3 claimed to have seen strange things that others did not believe and categorized as insanity. And both women were institutionalized because of it. It is a horrifying and depressing possibility that perhaps these women had seen paranormal activity that nobody else would believe. It makes you wonder if something is going on the land up there. Back in 1886, I found a newspaper report from Birmingham Suburban Times that said a terrifying ghostly apparition had been spotted in the Harborne and Edgbaston area. That's walking distance from Coxwell Road. The article's pretty dismissive of the story, suggesting it's got to be some sort of prank, but the paper admitted that the sighting of this ghost was in the mouths of everybody at the time because multiple witnesses claimed to have seen a terrifying ghostly visitor, described as being tall and having long, lean arms and horny, transparent hands and bright, phosphorized visage, and a very alarming appearance in the extreme. One witness told the paper that they saw this thing strutting in a contemplative mood athwart the grass lawn in front of the vicarage, and it presented an aspect unspeakably appalling. Was it a prank or something more sinister? Who can say? But it does come from a particular area of Birmingham where there's been a string of historic paranormal encounters, and it makes you wonder. Are there things going on that land today? And that's where I need you to help me with this investigation. Can you help spread the word amongst the people of Birmingham so they might get in touch if they have ever experienced anything paranormal in and around the Ladywood area, particularly around Coxwell Gardens and the surrounding streets, possibly even the Osler Street play area? Perhaps the land is quiet now, and the stories of historic ghost encounters are just that, historic. But if there are events still going on there, maybe we could discover them together. Though always remember to be respectful of the neighborhood. Real people and real families live there today. And so I must emphasize that we are not saying that present-day 32 Coxwell Gardens is the house we're talking about. No, we're not saying that. The original street, remember, is long gone, so the Pells house was somewhere in this area. So be sensitive as you explore, but if you spread the word and gather any more stories of this location, perhaps you could let us know. And maybe, maybe that's the most unsettling part of the Coxwell Road story, in that it may not have ended. It doesn't give us the tidy, comforting ending we want. The Pells escaped the house, sure. The house was demolished, yes. The street itself was wiped from the maps, true. And yet the pattern, what if it refuses to stay buried? You can call all of this coincidence, of course, maybe it is. You could call it grief, or just old buildings, or bad luck, or superstition, and maybe that's all we're talking about. But if even one thread of this is real, then it means something we hate to consider, that sometimes hauntings don't just frighten you, they target you, they weaken you, they isolate you, they push at the edges of your mind until you doubt their own senses, and they get between you and others and push an invisible wall between you so that you are on your own. In other words, they seem sometimes to delight in seeing us lost alone in the fog. But maybe Maybe if we can work together to push through these sorts of cases, we might remind ourselves that we are not alone, that we are together in this mist. And we can figure out what might be going on in this crazy, strange, frightening world. But at least we know we have traveling companions along the way. I'm one of them. And I'm Peter Laws. And you've been watching The Haunting That Turned Deadly. Good night.